Section 3. Captain Graff. Okay, this is a new character. We haven't had a reference to him before. Remember, in the first couple of sections, we only had Ender, and does anybody remember the name of the other student? Y'all remember who the other guy was? He had a funny name. Bean. Good. It was Bean. So here we are introducing a new character, Captain Graff. 6'2" and a little chubby, stroked his belly as he leaned back in his chair. So just get a picture of that, you know. How old do we think Captain Graff probably is? If he's 6'2". Could be, So we think he's probably grown up, right?
Yeah.
Because he's a captain. We also can tell a little bit about his personality, can we not? If he's leaning back in a chair and rubbing his fat belly.
He's lazy.
Could be. Could be. Across his desk sat Lieutenant Anderson, who was earnestly pointing out high points on the chart. Okay. Here it is, Captain, Anderson said. Ender's already got them doing a tactic that's going to throw off everyone who meets it. Double their speed. Graff nodded. And you know his test scores. He thinks well, too. Graff smiled. All true, Anderson. He's a fine student. He shows real promise. They waited. Graff sighed. So what do you want me to do? Ender's the one. He's got to be. He'll never be ready in time, Lieutenant. He's 11, for heaven's sake, man. What do you want? A miracle? So what are they talking about? What are they trying to get him ready for? What do y'all think? What could it be? These two men are analyzing data. And one of them, what do you think, Dalton?
Is getting ready for a fight.
Could be getting ready to make him ready for battle. Okay, I'm going to scoot this up a little bit. I want him into battles every day starting tomorrow. I want him to have a year's worth of battles in a month. Graff shook his head. That would be his army in the hospital. No, sir, he's getting them into shape, and we need Ender. Correction, Lieutenant. We need somebody, and you think it's Ender. Okay. All right, I think it's Ender. Which of the commanders, if it isn't him? I don't know, Lieutenant. Graff ran his hands over his slightly fuzzy, bald head. These are children, Anderson. Do you realize that? Ender's army is 9 years old. Are we going to put them against the older kids? Are we going to put them through hell for a month like that? So why does Captain Graff think Ender cannot fulfill the task? What is Graff saying here?
He's trying to say younger kids.
Yeah, He's saying that the younger kids are too young to be put through this. So let's type our answer in. You got to type your answer in right there. Why does Captain Graff think Ender cannot fulfill the task? And it's right there next to the question. He's worried about the fact that they're too young. They're not ready. Putting children through that kind of pressure is, it's not right, is it? Ethically. Mm-mm. Do what?
It's not looking time.
It's not letting you talk?
Yeah, it's too slow.
Maybe it's,
Oh, never mind.
okay, maybe it's just being hesitating. All right. So let's see how this conversation ends because, Lieutenant Anderson is pushing for Ender and his group to be ready for battle. And Captain Graff is hesitant. Sometimes we get these ideas in our head and we have these goals we have to meet. And sometimes we're willing to do anything to meet those goals, even if it's doing something unethical. Okay? In your life, as you get older, you may come in contact with someone in your job that's very competitive. And they're willing to do anything to get a raise or to get noticed or to get, to be the top salesman so that they get a bonus at the end of the month. And they might do things that are unethical to you and other people on your sales team or whatever group you're in order so that they can be successful. And that's human nature. That's a fact of life. Now, is it right? No, it's not. But just know in real life that there are people in this world who will try to step on you to get ahead. Okay? And that's not the way to get ahead. But that's something that you may have even already noticed it. Like if you play on a team, if you're on the soccer team or the football team or baseball team, you may have noticed that there's certain people on the team that take risks. They're willing to do anything to win. Or maybe they want to just stand out to the coach so they can get a better position or they can get a starting position rather than standing on the sidelines. You've seen people like that. And so that's kind of the position that Lieutenant Anderson is in. He's desperate because he's got to have somebody ready to fight in a battle. And so he's trying to find, right now in the moment, he thinks his best choice is Ender. Okay? So he continues on saying, Ender's test scores, Captain. He's even had great scores. I've seen his bloody test scores. I've watched him in battle. I've listened to tapes of his training sessions. I've watched his sleep patterns. I've heard tapes of his conversations in the corridors and in the bathrooms. Okay. This sounds a little dystopian, doesn't it? This leader has been listening in and following Ender kind of like a big brother would do. Okay? Think about it. They've observed him. Of course, they know his test scores. But look and see where it goes too far. They've been monitoring him in training sessions. Well, that doesn't seem too bad. But look at the next part. They've watched his sleep patterns. That's a little creepy, isn't it? What about, I've heard tapes of his conversations in the corridors. They've been taping his conversations in the corridors and in the bathrooms. They've been spying on him. Is that right? No. That's dystopian. That's an adult taking advantage of a child.
They're all in his business.
Yeah, they're all up in his business, and that is wrong, and that's a characteristic of a dystopian story. You've got somebody in power that is stepping beyond the boundaries of what is right. They're getting in his private business. That would be the same thing as if we started planting things around school to capture your conversations so that we could know, and we could catch you doing something wrong. We could put little cameras in the bathrooms so that we could monitor you in the bathroom. That's creepy. We would never do that, okay? That is taking it too far. But we do have some cameras placed around public areas on campus for your safety, because we've been able to catch bad people by seeing them on camera, identifying people doing something they shouldn't be doing. but we are never going to have a camera in a bathroom. That crosses the line, It's not right. But in a dystopian story, they might do it because in dystopia, somebody has control and they take advantage of the power that they have, and they do things to try to control what's going on. They want to know every move that Ender is making. Okay, they want to control him. Let's keep going. And against all the arguments, against his obvious qualities, I'm weighing one thing. I have this picture of Ender a year from now, if you have your way. I see him completely useless, worn down, a failure, because he was pushed farther than he or any living person could go. But it doesn't weigh enough, does it, Lieutenant? Because there's a war on, and our best talent is gone, and the biggest battles are ahead. So give Ender a battle every day this week and then bring me a report. Anderson stood and saluted. Thank you, sir. He had almost reached the door when Graff called his name. He turned and faced the captain. Anderson, Captain Graff said, have you been outside lately? Not since last leave. 6 months ago. Okay, so they're on this base and they haven't been out in the regular world. And he hasn't been out in 6 months. Okay? Don't you think that's a little strange? They have these boundaries where they cannot leave or they just don't want to leave. Okay, again, that's a dystopian characteristic of a dystopian story. I didn't think you had, not that it makes any difference, but have you ever been to Beeman Park there in the city? It's a beautiful park. Trees, grass, no mallow, no battles, no worries. Do you know what else there is in Beeman Park? What, sir? Lieutenant Anderson asked. Children, Graff answered. Of course children, said Anderson. Children. Kids who get up in the morning when their mothers call them and they go to school, and then in the afternoons, they go to Beeman Park and play. They're happy. They smile a lot. They laugh. They have fun. I'm sure they do, sir. Is that all you can say, Anderson? Anderson cleared his throat. It is good for children to have fun, I think, sir. I know I did when I was a boy. But right now, the world needs soldiers, and this is the way to get them. Graff nodded and closed his eyes. Oh, indeed, you're right. By statistical proof and by all the important theories, and there's a profane word, they work and the system is right. But all the same, Ender's older than I am. He's not a child. He's barely a person. I think that should say younger. If that's true, sir, then at least we all know that Ender is making it possible for the others of his age to be playing in the park. And Jesus died to save all men, of course. Graff sat up and looked at Anderson almost sadly. But we're the ones, Graff said. We're the ones who are driving in the nails. So what is the literary device that's being used here? Is it metaphor, alliteration, or allusion? In this part here where he starts talking about Jesus. It's allusion. Remember when we had the allusion activity where we talked about allusions being references to other things? When the writer mentions something from the Bible or they mention something about another thing that happened in our history, or maybe they mention something about another famous person. Those are allusions. So they've alluded to who? Jesus. It's a biblical allusion. And it has to do with the crucifixion, right? And Jesus being the Savior. So let's back up a little bit and see why they use that allusion in to wrap up this section. This doesn't make sense. Oh, you're right. By the statistical proof, by all the important theories, they work and the system is right. But all the same, Ender's older than I am. He's not a child. He's barely a person. If that's true, sir, then at least we all know that Ender is making it possible for the others of his age to be playing in the park. So his rationale is Ender is almost like saving the children. If we put him in this position to fight in a battle, yes, Cortavius, you need to turn off the lights? Okay, but now why don't you hit the far left switch? That'll take some of the lights down. There we go. So they're comparing Ender to Jesus as a type of savior who comes to save the children. He's a little bit older, but he's a child, but he's going to be the one that could possibly save the children, just like Jesus died to save the world. But notice the part that they talk about, we are the ones that are driving in the nails. Okay? We are the ones driving in the nails. He's saying we are the ones who are forcing this to happen. Okay? If you recall in the crucifixion story, Jesus was crucified on the cross, and there were soldiers who nailed him to the cross and executed him. They crucified him, right? So when you're comparing Ender to be this savior to potentially save the world, this dystopian world, just like Jesus did when he came to save the world. But then the men say, but we are the ones that are actually driving in the nails. We're the ones that are causing Ender to do this. So it's a dilemma. You know, they agree to do it. Graf gives in and he agrees to let Ender be the leader. But he also knows that he's taken a life into his hands that he's not sure that he ought to or not. But he's going ahead and doing it anyway. Okay? It's an ethical choice that he's making. He ought not to do it. Right? You have the little angel on one shoulder and the devil on another shoulder, and you have the angel saying, don't do it, don't do it. Then you have the devil saying, oh, you should do it, it's going to be okay, just do it. So ethically, he was faced with a choice that he had to make, and he's going ahead and do it. Okay? Because in his mind, he's trying to convince himself that it's the right thing to do. Okay? So let's go ahead and read on into section 4 to see if it is the right thing to do. Section 4. Ender Wiggins lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. He never slept more than 5 hours a night, but the lights went off at 2200 and didn't come on again until 0600, so he stared at the ceiling and thought. We've got one more question here that we need to answer for section 3. Why are the children doing the fighting? What is the irony here? Why are the children doing the fighting? They referenced it earlier. If you look back up, keep going. Okay, look right here. Let me make this a little bit bigger. If you notice in this part, he says, but it doesn't weigh enough, does it, Lieutenant? Because there's a war on. Our best talent is gone. The biggest battles are ahead. Okay? So that's why they're having to use children. Because maybe the older ones are gone. Maybe the best ones that they had are dead. And they don't have any choice because they're still at war and they've got battles they've got to fight. Okay? So let's go back to our question. And what's ironic then about the children fighting? The irony is, who ought to be doing fighting? The men. Okay, so that's the irony. So there's a two-part question. On the first part, you're going to type in about the fact that there's a battle going. The children are fighting because there's a battle. And the older ones are gone. The irony is the men ought to be doing the fighting, not the children. Okay? Okay? So here at the beginning of section 4, we're back to Ender, the scene where he's laying in his bed. It's the middle of the night. He doesn't sleep. Okay? He'd had his army for 3.5 weeks. Dragon Army. So remember that. That's the name of his army, Dragon Army. The name was assigned and it wasn't a lucky one. Oh, the charts said about 9 years ago, Dragon Army had done fairly well, but for the next 6 years, the name had been attached to inferior armies, armies that had not been doing that well, okay? And finally, because of the superstition that was beginning to play about the name, Dragon Army was retired. That name, they decided to not use it anymore because people felt like it was jinxed. Like, oh, if you're on Dragon Army, you're going to be bad because Dragon Army is bad. Okay? Until now. And now, Ender thought, smiling, Dragon Army was going to take them by surprise. So that was going to be a way to trick the other team or the other opposing faction because they assume that Dragon Army is still bad. Okay, so that's going to be an advantage that he knows he has. He can trick them or surprise them. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and delete this now because it doesn't need to stay in here because we've got other people looking at this and working on this. Okay, let's see. The door opened quietly. Ender did not turn his head. Someone stepped softly into his bedroom and left with the sound of the door shutting. When soft steps died away, Ender rolled over and saw a white slip of paper lying on the floor. He reached down and picked it up. Dragon Army against Rabbit Army, Ender Wiggins and Karn Carby, 0700. The first battle. Ender got out of bed and quickly dressed. He went rapidly to the rooms of each of the toon leaders and told them to rouse their boys. In 5 minutes, they were all gathered in the corridor, sleepy and slow. Ender spoke softly. First battle, 0700 against Rabbit Army. I fought them twice before, but they've got a new commander. Never heard of him. They're an older group, though, and I knew a few of their old tricks. Now wake up. Run, double fast, warm up in workroom 3. For an hour and a half they worked out, with 3 mock battles and calisthenics in the corridor out of the nullo. Then for 15 minutes they all lay up in the air, totally relaxing in the weightlessness. At 0650, Ender roused them and they hurried into the corridor. Ender led them down the corridor, running again and occasionally leaping to touch a light panel on the ceiling. The boys all touched the same light panel, and at 0658 they reached their gate to the battle room. That kind of reminds me of how football players will, when they're getting ready to run out, they have a thing usually on the wall. Everybody touches it like for good luck. That's what I used to do up here on my doorway. Hashtag we are ready. That's what we did that last year in the spring when we felt like, we are getting ourselves pumped up and ready for our standardized tests. Everybody, as they were leaving every day, they would come up and pop that on their way out the door. And it was just their way to say, hey, I'm ready. I'm ready for anything. So that's what that reminds me of, them going out and everybody touching the same spot on the light panel. The members of Tunes C and D grabbed the first 8 handholds in the ceiling of the corridor. Tunes A, B, and E crouched on the floor. Ender hooked his feet into 2 handholds in the middle of the ceiling so he was out of everyone's way. "Which way is the enemy's door?" he hissed. "Down," they whispered back and laughed. "Flashers on." The boxes in their hands glowed green. They waited for a few seconds more, and then the gray wall in front of them disappeared and the battle room was visible. Ender sized it up immediately. The familiar open grid of most early games, like the monkey bars at the park, with 7 or 8 boxes scattered through the grid. They called the boxes stars. There were enough of them and in forward enough positions that they were worth going for. Ender decided this in a second and he hissed, "Spread to the near stars. E-hold." The 4 groups in the corners plunged through the force field at the doorway and fell down into the battle room. Before the enemy even appeared through the opposite gate, Ender's army had spread from the door to the nearest stars. Then the enemy soldiers came through the door. From their stance, Ender knew they had been in a different gravity and didn't know enough to disorient themselves from it. They came through standing up, their entire bodies spread and defenseless. "Kill him, E!" Ender hissed and threw himself out the door, knees first, with his flasher between his legs and firing. While Ender's group flew across the room, the rest of Dragon Army laid down a protecting fire, so that E group reached a forward position, with only one boy frozen completely, though they had all lost the use of their legs, which did not impair them in the least. Remember, because they practiced that at the beginning of the story. There was a lull as Ender and his opponent, Karn Carby, assessed their positions. Aside from Rabbit Army's losses at the gate, there had been few casualties, and both armies were near full strength. But Karn had no originality. He was in the 4-corner spread that any 5-year-old in the teacher squads might have thought of, and Ender knew how to defeat it. He called out loudly, "E covers A, C down, B, D, angle east wall." Under E-Tune's cover, B and D-Tunes lunged away from their stars. You see how he is a masterful tactician, right? He's a really good planner. He's got everything organized, and when he makes a command, everybody knows exactly what to do. He's got it all planned out. He's a very good tactician. Remember that word from vocabulary? Let's see. While they were still exposed, A and E-Tunes left their stars and drifted toward the near wall. They reached it together, and together jackknifed off the wall. At double the normal speed, they appeared behind the enemy's stars and opened fire. In a few seconds, the battle was over, with the enemy almost entirely frozen, including the commander, and the rest scattered to the corners. For the next 5 minutes, in squads of 4, Dragon Army cleaned out the dark corners of the battle room and shepherded the enemy to the center. where their bodies, frozen at impossible angles, jostled each other. Then Ender took 3 of his boys to the enemy gate and went through the formality of reversing the one-way field by simultaneously touching a Dragon Army helmet at each corner. Then Ender assembled his army in vertical files near the knot of frozen Rabbit Army soldiers. Only 3 of Dragon Army soldiers were immobile. Their victory margin, 38-0, was ridiculously high, and Ender began to laugh. Dragon Army joined him, laughing long and loud. They were still laughing when Lieutenant Anderson and Lieutenant Morris came in from the teacher gate at the south end of the battle room. Lieutenant Anderson kept his face stiff and unsmiling, but Ender saw him wink as he held out his hand and offered the stiff, formal congratulations that were ritually given to the victor in a game. Morris found Carncarby and unfroze him, and the 13-year-old came and presented himself to Ender, who laughed without malice and held out his hand. Carn graciously took Ender's hand and bowed his head over it. It was that or be flashed again. Lieutenant Anderson dismissed the Dragon Army, and they silently left the battle room through the enemy's door. Again, part of the ritual. A light was blinking on the north side of the square door, indicating where the gravity was in that corridor. Ender, leading his soldiers, changed his orientation and went through the force field and into gravity on his feet. His army followed him at a brisk run back to the workroom. When they got there, they formed up into squads, and Ender hung in the air watching them. "Good first battle," he said, which was excuse enough for a cheer which he quieted. Dragon Army did all right against rabbits, but the enemy isn't always going to be that bad. And if that had been a good army, we would have been smashed. We still would have won, but we would have been smashed. Now, let me see, B and D tunes out here. Your takeoff from the stars was way too slow. If Rabbit Army knew how to aim a flasher, you all would have been frozen solid before A and C even got to the wall. They worked out for the rest of the day. So you see, there was no rest. Immediately after the battle, they went straight back to the workroom and they talked about what they did wrong. Okay? Isn't that what good teams do? They always, immediately after the game, they talk about what they did wrong and how they can make corrections and adjustments so that they don't make those mistakes in the next game, right? That's a good tactic. Let's see what's next. That night, Ender went for the first time to the commander's mess hall. What's a mess hall?
Where you eat.
Where you eat. It's like they call it that in the military, don't they? So it's a military word for like the cafeteria. No one was allowed there until he had won at least one battle, and Ender was the youngest commander ever to make it. There was no great stir when he came in, but when some of the other boys saw the dragon on his breast pocket, they stared at him openly, and by the time he got his tray and sat at an empty table, the entire room was silent, with the other commanders watching him, intensely self-conscious. Ender wondered how they all knew and why they looked so hostile. So why were the other commanders staring silently at Ender? Why were they staring at him? What do you think, Dalton?
Because the Dragon Army was known not to do good.
Okay, yeah, they were assuming, they were like, what are you doing here? You know, what do you think you're doing here? They were just kind of staring him down. So go ahead and answer that. Because the Dragon Army, like Dalton said, was known for being a bad army. But they looked at him with hostility. Now let's see what happens next in the cafeteria. Then he looked above the door he had just come through. There was a huge scoreboard across the entire wall. It showed the win-loss record for the commander of every army. That day's battles were lit in red, only 4 of them. The other 3 winners had barely made it. The best of them had only 2 men whole and 11 mobile at the end of the game. Dragon Army's score of 38 mobile was embarrassingly better. So, not only were they scrutinizing him because of his Dragon Army patch, they had already seen that score up on the scoreboard. And how did they feel about that? They didn't like it. They didn't want to be shown up by a 9-year-old, 11-year-old, however old he is. He's the youngest one in the room. Again, it's an age thing, right? Sometimes people use age to impose their power on younger people, don't they? Sometimes adults use their age to impose their power on younger people. So in this case, these other commanders are, they're mad because they should have been the best ones, not Ender, at least in their mind. Other new commanders had been admitted to the commander's mess hall with cheers and congratulations. Other new commanders hadn't won 38-0. He was so much better than the rest of them. It was clearly a blowout of epic proportions, okay? He was better than all the others. You just kind of get jealous when you're not as good as the very best. You can't help but be a little jealous of them. Ender looked for Rabbit Army on the scoreboard. He was surprised to find that Karn Carby's score to date was 8 wins and 3 losses. Was he that good? Or had he only fought against inferior armies? Whichever, there was still a 0 in Karn's mobile and whole columns, and Ender looked down from the scoreboard grinning. No one smiled back, and Ender knew that they were afraid of him, which meant that they would hate him, which meant that anyone who went into battle against Dragon Army would be scared and angry and less competent. So think about that for a minute. He's using their anger and their fear against them because he thinks that that's going to make them weaker mentally, right? So he can attack them smarter because they have been mentally weakened by the fact that he is so good. Ender looked for Karn Carby in the crowd and found him not too far away. He stared at Carby until one of the other boys nudged the rabbit commander and pointed to Ender. Ender smiled again and waved slightly. Carby turned red, and Ender, satisfied, leaned over his dinner and began to eat.